Thanks, Emma. Thanks, everyone, for your time. Apologies, I'm a tiny bit late. It's great to see you all. As you already know, this has been in the making for a while, and ultimately it marks the first output since the development of CAF's learning and evidence framework and our theory of change. As you know really well, CAF supports a diverse range of projects across the UK, and our aspiration for this survey is to create a helpful tool that will allow us to collect consistent data across the program, and that will help us address some of the key questions that arise from our program's theory of change. What did our program achieve? Where did we deliver? Who did we reach? What types of activities did we deliver? Of course, this survey will not capture everything. There's a wealth of qualitative information, case studies, anecdotal learning, and systematic learning emerging from your projects. So you will capture this through your project evaluations and in conversations with your portfolio officers as part of your standard grant management process. The survey is not meant to replace these efforts. There's still an expectation that you will continue with your evaluation and learning plans, measuring the impacts that matter and that they're relevant to your own projects. Flexibility is at the heart of the design process. We don't expect any project to change their evaluation and data collection systems that they're already in place to address the questions in the survey. This is the first iteration, and while we have tested the questions with a few organizations, we encourage you to provide feedback to your portfolio officers, and there's designated space for feedback at the end of the survey to ensure that we can improve it as we go along. I won't take more of the time because this is only an hour session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Emma and Mary to talk to you through the survey and provide some tips that will help you to collect data to answer the questions. And myself and Colleen, my colleague from the evaluation team, who has been leading on the development of the survey, will be at the meeting. Will stay to support with any questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ari. And just for those of you joining us just in the last minute or two, as Mary goes through the slides, do please feel free to put questions into the chat, which we'll respond to as we go along, or there will also be plenty of time towards the end of the session for an open question and answer session. So I'll hand over to Mary now for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thanks, Ari, for that great introduction, kind of setting the scene for this annual grant holder survey. So this is a very practical session. We're going to be talking about giving you a little bit more background, but then looking at the questions, particularly at the ones that ask for data, which I think some of the questions are very easy to answer. You'll know the answer. You could fill it in straight away. There'll be others where you may need to dig around and find information to answer the questions. So we anticipate that those will be the tricky ones, and those are the ones that we're going to focus on today. But we've left some time at the end to talk about any of the questions, and we will go through in 4 sections today, with a bit of time for questions and discussion in between each of those. So starting with a bit more on the purpose and the background. So as Ari was saying, this is part of CAF's broader program to gather evidence, and it's focusing on the outputs that are relatively simple to measure across the whole cohort, to give a picture of the cohort as a whole. The fund knows that these are they're relatively simple. Some of them are quite kind of reductionist measures. They don't give the full depth, but as Ari was saying, the full depth will come out in your wider evidence gathering and your project evaluation work. But these are measures that the fund feels are meaningful at some level across the cohort as a whole. So the fund's very keen to establish a baseline across the programme. So although in future the annual grant holder survey will be part of your ongoing annual monitoring and will be done at different times for different projects, for this first baseline, you're being asked to provide a snapshot of data for the past year or so. I'll come on to the time scale in a moment. And the idea is to have to build a picture of the programme on these variables. So later rounds will be integrated into your end of year progress report. It's important to note that your responses won't influence future funding decisions. So this is not something that you're going to be assessed against. It's just to build a picture of the portfolio. And importantly, if you don't know the answer to the question, please either there will be guidance either to put in an estimate, or there's normally an option to say that you don't know if you're not collecting something. So as Ari said, you're not being expected to go out and change how you collect data. It's kind of what you've got available at the moment within your organization or partner organizations. And you may, after this session, have further questions. When you're thinking about the detail of how to answer certain questions, your portfolio officer will be available, and the guidance that accompanies the survey will be available to help you through that, and we'll point you towards the guidance at the end of this session. So what's it for? Gathering consistent information across all the projects against key monitoring indicators from the theory of change, not just about your aims and activities, but about kind of how far they're reaching people, because engagement is such an important part of Climate Action Fund objectives. It will be used in future to identify areas on which the fund may commission further research, or may look in more detail across the programme, kind of do a deep dive. So some of the issues we'll come on to, have you done any work looking at improving the internal fairness or equity of your operations? There may be things that are or have you measured carbon? There may be areas where the fund wants to dive a bit deeper later. And there may be some topics that come up where the scope for more learning between projects in the portfolio. So the other thing that may come out, another reason for doing this, is to identify gaps in the portfolio. What is the coverage? What is the full scope of the activities that you're doing to inform future fund activities? So some very top of the head tips on how to approach the survey. Remember to answer it on behalf of your whole project, which will normally include partners. There are 3 projects which have an arrangement called an equitable partnership, where there isn't a single lead organisation, and each organisation leads its own part of the project. So if you know that you're an equitable partnership, you will know that if you are one, then you can opt for partners to submit responses separately. But it's, again, you could decide to do it for the partnership as a whole if that was easier and avoided less duplication between the answers. The first question in the survey is about the time period you're reporting on. And this is very important because you don't have to kind of do 12 months up to September or August 2023. You've got flexibility on that because the fund is aware that you may have been collecting data on a different timetable. So there's flexibility. If your project only started within the last 12 months, it may be a shorter period that you're reporting on. But I'll show you question 1 in a moment. You can literally specify the start date and end date to show. You just need to be clear about what period you're reporting on. One of the issues that you may come across if you are in the process of moving from a development grant, or you've just moved from a development grant to a full award, is where do you draw the boundary between those two projects? To keep things clear, the fund would like you to report on one of those projects, and you might want to discuss with your portfolio officer which one it's more appropriate to report on. If your full project started a decent number of months ago, say 6 months ago or so, it might be appropriate to report on that. But if it's only just started, it may be more appropriate to report on the development grant stage. But please avoid mixing the two, because this data needs to be specific to a particular grant. Top tip is look at the questions offline, look at the guidance which set out all the questions and similar guidance to what we're going to go through today, and gather the information in advance, because you can complete the survey online, but you probably won't know all the answers to the questions before you log on, as it were. And the fund has prepared guidance with detailed questions, a kind of matrix of what the question is, and then hand-holding guidance so that you can see what's going to come up when you do eventually log on. So once you've got the information to hand, it should be quite quick to do, and you can save the survey as you go, so you can partly fill it in and come back to it. The deadline is Friday the 20th of October for submissions, but please don't leave it till then, because you'll have, you might suddenly discover that you needed to ask partners a question or two, and it will be please do leave time to do that. So just giving you a quick overview of the questions so that you know what's coming up. There's a time frame question, which I'll go through in a minute. Details of your project, which should be very straightforward, the aims of the project. And then we get into some of the data questions. So some of you may have looked at it already, but I'll go through this for the benefit of anybody who hasn't. So there are a number of questions which ask about people and kind of numbers of people. So paid staff, volunteers, internal practices is slightly different. The focus of your climate action and your location, those again will be, I think, relatively easy to answer. But then again, questions about organizations who are involved and organizations you have connections with, the diversity of the communities you're targeting, or the diversity of the communities you're reaching. We'll go into that in some detail later. The number of people engaged overall, and we can talk about what engaged means, crucial question. The types of activities you're delivering in detail, and then some of the output measurements for those types of activities. And those may be things you're collecting there, they may not, that's fine. We'll go through that in a few minutes. Carbon estimates, carbon sequestration, carbon emissions, again, we'll come on to that towards the end of this session. Additional funding leveraged by your Climate Action Fund grant. A kind of high-level question about what the most significant change has been for your project over that period, and then your opportunity to give feedback. So that's a quick look at what's in the survey. In terms of high-level guidance, you don't have to have accurate data available, so don't panic, don't worry too much. You can just give estimates, or you can say you're unsure. And the fund team will not be coming back to you and saying, well, where's the evidence for this number? They know that some of these numbers will be estimates. So these are the questions we're planning to focus on. They're the data ones, but at the end we can cover any of the other questions that you're interested in as well. And just before we stop for a discussion break, I just wanted to show you the reporting timetable question. So this is the screen, or these are the screens you will get in the when you open up the survey. So I don't know if people can see that, but on this first frame you can enter the start date and end date, and then you specify whether you're answering the questions for a development grant or a full grant, and you give the project ID in this box, which should be relatively straightforward. So the crucial thing to think about is what start and end date you're going to use for the data, and you can flex that to suit the data that you have available. So before we get on to some of those detailed questions, are there any general questions about what the fund's asking for and how feasible this is?
Mary, there was a question about how projects should complete this, or whether projects should complete this that only started quite recently. I think you've just addressed that. So Claire, yes, if you're a more recent grant, you should complete it, but you don't have to do it obviously for a 12-month period. You can choose your period, so choose your start date as the start of when you got your grant, and report on to the nearest moment now that you can, and just specify what period you're covering. There's another question about question 7, which we haven't got onto yet, Mary, so should we leave that for the next bit? And a question from Mary about whether it's online or a Word document, and it's online. I don't know, is it possible to download it? Actually, I'm not sure about that, Mary, do you know?
I think the guidance effectively has a downloaded version, so I don't think you can complete it offline and then upload it, but you can look at the questions offline and kind of prepare your data, and you can part complete the survey and then go back to it. So you can toggle backwards and forwards within the survey.
Does anyone else feel free to put your hand up, or just shout out if you've got any overarching questions before Mary goes on to the next section.
And we can come on to question 7. I'll make time for that at the end.
Oh, and just one other question that's just come in about the flexibility of dates. So if people have an annual time frame, for example, of May to May, then would May 22 to May 23 be an acceptable reporting period? My understanding is that it would. Is that right, Mary?
That's my understanding. I'm looking for a nod from Ari. Yes, thank you. So yes, exactly. If you've got a monitoring timetable that runs from May to May, the flexibility allows you to use that data. The idea is not to burden you with an additional round of data collection when you've already got your systems set up. Okay.
Can I just check in on the start date again, because it was purely because when I was looking at emails this morning, it said that this survey was for if your project had started prior to May, but ours started on May the 1st, but we've been invited for this. So that just got me a little bit confused, because we'll only be able to give 5 months of data, which is quite short. So I just wanted to double check that.
I think that's a question for Ari, probably.
I can answer that very quickly. So thanks for flagging. You've been invited to the survey because your project was committed before May. So
Right.
that's why you were at the cutoff point. Your offer letter is the 1st of May. So if you have already some data over the last 5 months, yes, the answer is yeah. We would like to participate to the survey and share with us the data up to this point.
Okay, because what we're doing is gathering data quarterly from the partners. So currently, I've only got data for May, June, and July. Should I just input the data for that first quarter then?
Yes, that would be fine. Just indicate, as Mary said, indicate the dates that you are covering in the first question that asks for reporting time frame, and that will be absolutely fine.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for those questions and clarifications, because if you're asking them, somebody else will be thinking the same question. So it's really helpful to have those probes. So shall we move on to the questions about which are asking for numbers? So data about people, organizations, diversity and engagement. So this is quite a long section covering a few questions, but we'll again allow some time for discussion at the end. And if you've got any questions as we're going along, please do put them in the chat. So one of the basic questions early on in the survey is, how many paid staff are there paid for by CAF grant money in terms of full-time equivalents? And that includes people in the different partner organizations involved in your project. Things to watch out for is that temporary staff or kind of contractors, including if you have one, an evaluation contractor, don't count. It's kind of retained staff, paid roles that are being asked about. And you'll see that as well as the option to enter a number, which could be an estimate, there's a kind of don't know or a not applicable option. Maybe you don't have any paid roles paid for by the grant. So that one hopefully won't be too taxing, but I can see that we can, if you have any questions about how to define that, we'll come on to that in the discussion session. Then there's a question about number of volunteers. Now, importantly, this isn't a kind of full-time equivalent number. It's a total number of how many volunteers roughly are involved, however much time they contribute, whether it's 1 hour a week or 5 days a week. This may be more difficult to estimate across your project as a whole, but do your best. And remember that more is not necessarily better. So the fund is aware that this is it's a very broad brush measure. It doesn't give a flavor of how deeply volunteers are involved, but it will give a flavor as to how far the reach in volunteers is going. And where it says in the past 12 months, I think you should interpret that as in the period you're reporting on, how many volunteers have there been. So you might not be reporting on 12 months. So anyone spending unpaid time helping your project to achieve its aims, that wouldn't necessarily include people who kind of came along to a training session. I suppose it would include people who were helping to deliver activities, I don't know, helping to run a stall, helping you to do the project, not just participating in it. We'll come on to kind of the engagement side of things later. The next one is that may be tricky to answer is the connections. So question 9 has a bit about kind of who are your partners, which should be quite straightforward. But this part of the question is about the connections that the partnership has and roughly how many organizations you work with. So there's a range of categories to tick here. from registered charities, environment focused or not, voluntary and community groups, network organizations and partnerships. If you work with town councils, the local council, they would count as statutory bodies, faith organizations, schools, public services, private businesses, media, communication specialists, behavior change experts, academic bodies, and then foundations or other grant-making bodies. And there's also an option to kind of specify some other kind of category. So if you are working with an organization that kind of blurs across those boundaries, you've got the partnership option here, or you can choose the main category they fall into. I suppose there's a question as to, you know, how strong does a connection have to be to put them in here? So they should be at least organizations that you know by name, or where you've had some connection with their staff, the people in those organizations. So and I can see a question, would you include the evaluator as a partner? I think as a connection. And I would have thought yes. Do you include a part? I'm looking for a response from Ari. Would you include the evaluator as part of the main partnership? I think that depends on your relationship with the evaluator, probably. If they are formally a partner, then I think you would include them in the partnership list.
Yes, correct, Mary.
Yeah.
If it's a contractor, then no.
Great, thanks. And I think what you may find if you've got a project involving different partners is that you need to do a little bit of looking out for duplication if each organization has connections with the local council or whatever. Try to count the organizations once rather than multiple times across different partners. So you might need to develop a list of the organizations you're dealing with. Coming on to the diversity of communities, this is a multi-part question, and how you go through the question depends which options you select earlier on. So at the beginning, you're asked whether you target particular groups of people, or whether you run activities that are open to everyone in the place you work, or whether you do a bit of both. And the questions that will then be posed reflect what answer you've given to these questions. So at this question, it's not, at this point, they're not asking about who you're reaching, it's are you targeting or not. And if you answer yes or both, so if you do at least some targeting, you then get asked about which groups you're targeting. And this some of these categories are kind of census type ethnic heritage categories, some are faith, some are about disabilities, and some are broader about health, gender, language, etc. So you're asked to specify which groups you're targeting. And then if you answered yes to the question about untargeted activities that are open to everyone, you're asked a question about who they reached. And you can, if there isn't a predominant group, you can tick as many of those as these options as apply, but there's an extra option down at the bottom here to say there isn't a predominant group. You know, it's very mixed. So these questions look very similar, but the question they're asking is different. One is who are you targeting, and the other is at open activities who's turning up or who's getting involved. And there
Mary,
is
can I just
yeah,
pause you there? We've got quite a lot of questions going back to the staffing, and I just wonder if we could address those now, because there are some also coming in. We're going to lose track of which ones they relate to.
yep.
So on the staffing, we've got questions about how or whether to account for staff turnover in the numbers. So if there's quite a bit of turnover, do you just count, so if somebody's replaced somebody else, do you count them as one, or do you account for the fact that you've got, a change in the staffing? And I guess in
Ari,
looking at this, that's probably more
yeah.
of an issue with volunteers, isn't it, than paid staff? Because paid staff, it's fairly clear it's about the full-time equivalents. So that would just be a question in terms of number of volunteers, in which case I guess the term you count every individual volunteer no matter how long they've stayed for.
Yes, so that if the full-time equivalent data for the staff would take account of the fact that if you've got one role which is passed on to somebody else, that would still be the same in terms of a full-time equivalent staff member. But I think if volunteers come and go, they would all be counted.
So hopefully, Georgina, that answers your question. Then South Yorkshire Climate Alliance wanted to know if the board of directors would be included in the volunteer count. And if they're voluntary, if they're not being paid for their input, then I would assume they would be included
As volunteers.
as volunteers. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then
we can include them, and we can update the guidance for everyone who hasn't been here today to kind of demonstrate that.
Okay. Tori's asking about whether it's the number of volunteers or the amount of hours they give, and it's the number of volunteers, isn't it?
Yes, definitely.
And then there was a question in relation to the partnerships, whether people should be reporting on active collaborations or just prospective relationship building. I think that was was that on the next slide, Mary? So this was a question from
I'll just move
Georgina
forward
again.
to that one. I think there would need to be some germs of collaboration there, not just the organizations you're hoping to get in touch with, but the ones that you are to some extent in touch with. It doesn't have to be, they don't have to be kind of, well, they wouldn't be project partners, but they don't have to be deeply involved, but they need to be more than just on your target list. I don't know if that answers the question.
And one other question on the staffing. So for very big projects, so there's one that has 3 main partners and 18 smaller organizations signed into the project. Should they be reporting on all of those in terms of staff employed? And should it just be staff who are 100% funded by this grant? Because a lot of projects have blended funding. Or should they be reporting on staff that are part funded by this?
And I think Ariana might have responded to that, saying that if they're partners in the project and receive grant money from CAF, then they would be included, but it should only be the CAF funded element of the project it's not kind of the total organization for all of those partners, it's the bits of the element of those organizations that's funded by the CAF grant.
And then I think there's one more, and then we're caught up. No, they're still coming in about diversity. So basically, someone said they haven't monitored this so far. It's very difficult because of fleeting interactions. So Mary, I think that's absolutely fine. That's one of the areas we could be looking at exploring in terms of advice going forwards. Do you know if you want to say anything on that?
Absolutely, that you can just say you don't know, and I know that targeting might include the fact that you've selected certain areas to work in, geographical areas, because of the characteristics of the communities there. You could think of that.
Right, I think we're caught up now. Back to you, Mary. Sorry to interrupt your flow.
Okay, no. The point is to have discussions. That's the point. So another element of kind of who you're engaging with is how far you're engaging with people who are new to climate change. So this is another one of those words which is a bit elastic. What does it mean, new to climate change? So, you know, to some extent you have to use your own judgment as to what that means. Previously limited or no involvement with your project's approach to addressing climate change. So I know that some of the people involved in projects up and down the country may be people who are really deeply committed on climate change and have been for some time. And for others, getting involved in a food project or getting involved in a nature project may be kind of opening their eyes to what's going on. So I suppose it's just trying to get some sort of estimate as to what proportion of people would fall into that second category, that this is kind of being an eye-opening experience for them. So this question asks for a broad kind of frequency of, do you engage with people new to climate, people or groups new to climate change, you know, always, almost always, or sometimes, rarely, almost never, or is it difficult to say? And then the second half of the question asks for kind of broad bands. Would that be kind of less than a quarter, more than three quarters, or somewhere in between? You may not have any data on this. This may be a kind of top of the head estimate, and you may want to say you don't know. But if you do have a feel for that, it would be helpful to the fund to know. And finally, on the people side, number of people engaged. So what does engagement mean? I think what we're talking about here is people who've participated in activities. They could be online or in person. They could have been along to a session, I don't know, doing some work in a garden somewhere. They could have been on a training course, attended a workshop. They don't have to have been to kind of many activities, but the one important thing here is to try not to double count. So if one person has been to a number of activities, try to keep them as one individual, or if a household has been engaged lots of times, is trying to count that household once to get an idea of the reach of your activities. The things not to include: paid staff, we counted them already, so don't include paid staff. If you're just sending people things, mailing lists, social media, kind of posts, downloads, you don't know how they've received that. You don't know that they've engaged with that. So don't count just kind of the number of followers that you have. It needs to be a bit more than that. I think there's awareness that engagement may be the same as the people who are engaged may be the same as those who benefit for the projects. But if your project is about campaigning or about kind of putting in measures to protect an area from flooding or something, the people who are engaged may not actually be the beneficiaries. So those who are engaged aren't necessarily the same as beneficiaries. Shall we have a pause for any questions on those? Because these, both diversity and new to climate change and engagement, are all potentially quite tricky to pin down and define. Any questions on those?
So there's one question about whether social media reach or engagement counts, and Ari's clarified that it doesn't. But I was slightly confused on that one, because if you go up a slide, Mary, there was some reference to social media there, which I thought said it included.
No, it says it does not
media.
include.
Yes.
It says it doesn't include.
So that's very clear there. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Would the number of opened newsletters count as engagement? Any thoughts on that?
I think
And also a question about whether is there any kind of digital engagement that would count?
Ari, do you want to come in on that?
We can update the guidance in relation to that, because I think it's a really good point. By engagement, we mean meaningful engagement. So if an organization ran a session, a consultation that took place online, via Zoom, and engaged sort of 50 people, that still counts as meaningful engagement. But by just like, if just somebody has like a number of followers, which they have the potential to have seen stuff or not to have seen stuff online, that doesn't count. So it's a little bit of a judgment call, but we can slightly update the guidance to reflect that in a little bit of more detail.
Maybe I can suggest if people have specific things they'd like to know, whether that counts or whether it doesn't, if you want to pop that in the chat, and then we'll make sure that that gets rounded up. Somebody else asked, will we be saving the chat? And yes, we will, and we'll share that with the recording afterwards, so we can make sure that we clarify any specific questions on that. Does anyone else have anything they want to raise on this at the moment? No, I can't see anything, so suggest you crack on, Mary.
Yes, time is ticking on. So just wanted to cover the questions about kind of data questions relating to the scale of activities, carbon and funding. So question 13 is about kind of measurable outputs from activities. And there's a menu there of the activities that the fund thinks might be relatively easy to measure. And you're asked to tick whether you're doing any of these activities: creating or improving community spaces, restoring land, diverting waste from landfill, growing food, creating jobs, training local champions, people receiving qualifications or energy audits, electric car schemes, offering energy advice, distributing grants, small grants in your own scheme. Please tick all the boxes there, even if you don't currently measure them, even if you're just doing them without kind of quantification. And then on the next slide, you'll be given a menu for the boxes that you ticked, where you can either put in an answer or leave it blank. And if you do those activities but don't measure them, then it's perfectly fine to leave the boxes blank, but it gives the fund an idea of the ways, I suppose, the number of projects working in those areas and where there might be scope in future to extend measurement a bit. So these are hopefully quite simple measures. So for instance, for the ones to do with land, it's meter squared. What area are you covering? Number of trees planted. I know that's a very broad, as soon as with any of these measures, if you look at the detail, you think, well, were they big trees, small trees, this species, that species? But just an idea of scale. And similarly, waste questions are generally in tons, or in some cases for repairs, number of items. And the food questions are also kind of weight measures, kilograms or tons. You'll need to put the units that you're using in the box, because if it says kilograms or tons, it will make a difference which unit you're putting. So just write those in. And some of these other measures are about kind of the number of energy audits completed, the number of local champions saved, local champions trained, the number of households given energy advice, estimated savings of energy use. If you know that, would be, it says kilowatts, but I think that should probably say kilowatt hours. That's the usual measure, if you know that, or it could just be the number of energy measures adopted. I'm going to move on because time is ticking on. Carbon estimates. some projects will be doing their own calculations on this, some won't. This question asks about carbon reduction and carbon sequestration, with sequestration being fixing or capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through, for example, tree planting, whereas carbon reduction might be through recycling or energy measures and so on. So you have various options of saying this has nothing to do with our project, through to yes, it has something to do with it, but we're not, you know, we've got estimates, or we haven't got estimates. And then the second part of this question puts in, you put in a number in terms of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent saved or sequestered, if you know that number. And if you don't know, you just tick the don't know box. If you do it, it would be helpful. The fund would like to know a bit about the method that you're using or the tools that you're using. You could, I mean, it might all be written up somewhere in a separate report, a monitoring or evaluation report, in which case you could just refer to that. But so if you don't know these numbers, it doesn't matter. But if you do know them, the fund is very interested to hear about them. And the last question that asks about numbers is one about leveraged funding, because it may be the case that getting the CAF grant helps you then to get other grants for your activities, for not just in your lead organization, but potentially in partner organizations as well. So having an estimate of what funding has been leveraged in, broken down from kind of public funders to trusts and foundations, private funders or individual donations, that helps to give the fund an idea of the kind of additional benefit that's being created through the grant that you're receiving. That's a very quick move through those number questions. Because we've only got kind of 5 or 10 minutes left, I might move on. I'll just flick through onto question 7, which somebody asked about. So this is a question about climate action focus. Which of the following policy areas did your project's activities focus on? And there was a question in the chat with somebody saying, you know, if you include all the partners, then you might end up ticking a lot of those boxes. My understanding is that's fine, because some of the projects are very, very wide-ranging, and across all your partners, you may be covering, you know, nearly all of those areas. But that's important information to the fund, so don't worry if you're ticking a lot of boxes. Okay, shall we go back and talk a bit about those last ones, the scale of activities, the carbon, and the leveraged funding, because those may be a bit tricky for some projects.
So I think a lot of the questions have been addressed in the chat, but there are a couple. One about, so we've said that projects don't need to adapt their data collection systems, but is the expectation that they will still go out to partners with this additional ask and ask what data they already hold and send through to them, which I think, yeah, Ari has just responded to, and it's basically yes, please. A couple of questions about double counting, which Ari's responded to. Georgina's just put in a question about asking for advice on the best way to source this information from partners. For example, it might be best to use a form to do that. And as Mary said earlier, you can access most of these questions in a downloaded format through the email that was sent out. So it probably wouldn't be that hard to turn that into a form of some kind. I don't know, Mary or Ari, whether you've got any thoughts on that or suggestions.
I think that because it's a Word, that's a Word document with the question and then guidance, it would be a relatively simple matter to insert a column into that, which you could share with partners to put their number into it, or their list of organizations or whatever it was. Ari, was that something you would want to leave to the projects to do?
Yeah, so basically it's down to the projects to do so in any way that works best for them. If it is helpful, and let us know, we could provide a spreadsheet basically that is got all the questions one by one on an Excel spreadsheet, so that we could produce that once rather than you producing it like 56 times for the different projects. But I'm not sure whether that's something you want or you need, or you have other ways of doing it.
And then a question about where evaluators are gathering data that isn't available yet. Is it all right to submit that later? And Colleen's basically given that a thumbs up. So yes, that's fine. And again, I think we're caught up on questions, but please feel free to put your hand up or just shout out if there's something we've missed.
And I suppose an interesting point there from Rachel in Bristol, that there is an expectation that you would ask partners what data they hold, not that they should go and collect data, but that if they hold it, you would kind of assemble it across the different partners you're working with. So John's got his hand up. Do you want to come in?
I just wondered if there's a definition of a green job, because we've sometimes found that quite hard to define precisely. Some of them are very obviously green jobs, but if a job perhaps working in a plumbing business, helping to develop heat pumps or something like that, would that count as a green job?
My feeling is that it would. That it's a kind of job related to the broad aims of your project. I would go for a slightly wider rather than narrower definition of green job. But I don't know, Ari.
I agree, Mary. Like anything, it's a really good question. We haven't provided, I think, a definition for that, but any kind of job that contributes towards environmental sustainability goals and helps reducing impacts of climate change on the environment would count as a green job. Go for a broad definition rather than a narrow one.
Thank you, that's helpful.
I think that's all the questions covered. If anybody has anything else, just feel free to put your hand up. As I said, we'll collate all the questions that are in the chat. We'll put those together with the responses to circulate with the recording.
And any questions about any of the parts of the survey that we haven't covered? Heather, do come in.
Hi there. Yeah, it's just a clarification, really. If we have any kind of questions that are forthcoming after this event, can I confirm that we are able to approach our portfolio holders for input or guidance?
Absolutely. That's the idea, that they will have the guidance plus any kind of refinements that come out in response to this session. So discuss it with them. And
that's great. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Emma, you or Ari, if somebody, I mean, the guidance, the list of questions plus the guidance in a table format, Word document, that was circulated, but is there somewhere that will sit online as well?
That's a good point, Mary. We can add that into the resource library as well. And when we share the recording, we can share an online link in the resource library for projects to have it as well.
Brilliant. So I think we're there. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you everybody for coming along. We'll aim to get that recording up online within the next couple of days. We'll share the link via Slack, and it will be in the resources library, and we'll try and put a link directly in the link tree as well, so that people can access it directly from that. Thank you all for sparing your time this morning, and hopefully see you at one of our coffee mornings very soon. Bye.
Great. Bye.
Thanks, Mary. Well done. That was